Welcome to my channel and welcome to a new podcast, Endgame for Globalism. A dark ideology is collapsing and what it means for investors. Are you interested in the topic? If so, then I recommend reading Dr. Polleit's Boom and Bust Report. All information at boombustreport.com. And now let's get started with Endgame for Globalism, a dark ideology is collapsing and what it means for investors. Post-globalism, that was the headline of the lead article in Dr. Polleit's Boom and Bust Report of January the 15th, 2026. In it, we showed why, how and along which lines the world is literally splitting apart into a Western Hemisphere and an Eastern Hemisphere. The central reason for this conclusion was the end of globalism or the beginning of a time after globalism, that is, post-globalism. But what exactly is meant by globalism? Globalism is understood as a political program according to which people should no longer shape their destinies on the planet in a system of free markets through self-determination, but rather their life should be coordinated, directed and controlled from above, from a central world authority, such as a global council of heads of state and government, an enlightened global elite. The most well-known think tanks of the globalists are probably the United Nations and the World Economic Forum, WEF. Above all, the topics publicly promoted by the WEF have long since become powerful political guidelines. Just think of climate policy, open border policy, digitization, especially digital vaccination passports, and central bank digital currency, public-private partnerships, transhumanism, in short, everything that falls under the term Great Reset. From an intellectual, historical perspective, the roots of globalism can be identified in collectivist, neo-socialist and also neo-Marxist doctrines. And even though there are different nuances of globalism, its central objective is always to push back, abolish the free market system, or the little that remains of it today, and expand the influence of the state or of special interest groups that know how to use the state for their purposes. The globalists deliberately avoid the old battle cry of the socialist Marxists like expropriate the property owners. Instead, they rely on appealing promises, such as a cleaner environment, fairer distribution, inclusion, etc. Yet they want to reach the same goal: to bury the free market system, to erode private property beyond recognition, to help a leadership elite achieve omnipotence, to establish something like a feudal world dictatorship. However, with the election of US President Donald J. Trump, globalism has now suffered a severe setback in the United States of America. This is also evident on the international level. In January 2025, the US withdrew from the Paris Climate Agreement. In January 2026, America left 66 international organizations, including the World Health Organization (WHO), and are raising doubts about the continued existence of NATO. The American voters want their government to change the previous course and renounce globalism. The Trump administration has already realigned the interests of the country with far-reaching consequences. As already mentioned, America's focus is now primarily on the Western Hemisphere. And something else has happened. On January the 30th, 2026, the US Department of Justice published the most comprehensive collection of the Epstein files to date. More than 3 million documents, 180,000 photos, 2,000 videos. Already now, shortly after the release, the revelations are proving to be extremely shocking. And one can certainly assume that everything is actually much worse than what the published documents show, since not everything is publicly accessible yet, or much has been redacted. And already now the first heads are starting to roll. There are resignations. Because the dark machinations of the powerful Epstein network, which has spread worldwide and consists of politicians, bureaucrats, corporate executives, scientists, artists, writers, media representatives, are now coming at least partially to light. And to the extent that the guilty are held accountable, publicly discredited, and hopefully also prosecuted criminally, globalism loses its previous supporters and followers. It then resembles the Titanic that tears open its hull on an iceberg, fills with water and sinks. It is indeed now quite possible that globalism and the globalists will suffer a severe, perhaps even final defeat. That as a result, the globalist institutions, think here for example of the United Nations, the European Union, the European Central Bank, the single euro currency, will come under scrutiny and perhaps not survive in their current form. However, the globalists will not lay down their arms without a fight. After their defeat in the US, they have taken refuge in Europe, in London, Berlin, Paris, Brussels, so to speak, and are building their defense lines here. Above all, they are concerned with controlling the public discourse, because they know that free speech, the unhindered discussion in the public sphere, in other words, enlightenment, the search for truth, and the answers that people inevitably arrive at, seals their defeat. In Europe, the globalists will therefore very likely try to defend their position even more strongly, to cover the population with censorship, even more unabashedly than before, to regulate social media by the state, in order to retain and defend control over people's minds. But can globalists hold out in Europe, survive without backing from America? The probability is not very high. January the 30th, 2026 was probably the beginning of a turning point with enormous implications. Perhaps in a few months or years, looking back at current events, one can truly speak of the beginning of the endgame for globalism. Against this backdrop, a number of pressing questions arise for investors. What does all this mean for economic and financial developments? Interest rates, stock markets, real estate, commodity and precious metals prices. Let's first look at the possible effects on the macroeconomic scene. Let us start with government debt, as it is a central instrument of the globalists to implement their agenda. It can be used to finance transfer payments and contracts through which voters and companies are corrupted and made loyal to the state and the system. And politicians, bureaucrats and special interest groups, say scientists, artists, etc., can also enrich themselves personally particularly well. Think, for example, of well-paid speaking engagements, board positions, appearances in state-funded media, etc. A turn away from globalism would lead one to expect that the increase in government debt will tend to slow down. It probably won't stop completely. After all, every state and every generation of politicians currently holding the levers of power has an interest in increasing state spending and preferably financing it with new debt. But at least a turn away from globalism speaks in itself for at least a slowing of the growth in government debt. And then there is monetary policy. An end to globalism narrows the leeway for central bankers to align their monetary policy unreservedly with the needs of the banking and financial industry. It will at least become smaller. If the political establishment turns away from globalism, monetary policy can no longer be solely about the interests of Wall Street, but the interests of Main Street will have to be taken into account. Consequently, one would expect a less inflationary, less interest rate distorting monetary policy. And finally, with the turn away from globalism, the idea of the nation-state becomes more popular. The interest of the national populations in their own well-being increases. Global issues lose their appeal and attention. Output expansion and more jobs become desirable goals again, and climate policy, uncontrolled open border policies, and favoring supranational institutions at the expense of national sovereignty come to an end. In short, a turn away from globalism would at least tend to be associated with a return of market forces, declining government deficits, less inflationary monetary policy, and less pressure on central banks to keep interest rates artificially low. Having said that, is the endgame for globalism actually accompanied by hope for an improved economic outlook? Well, that will depend crucially on economic growth. One must consider that turning away from globalism amounts to a regime change. Economies whose production and employment are relatively little infected by globalist ideas will cope relatively well with the regime change, the return to normality. In contrast, one must expect relatively high production and employment losses in economies that are very strongly influenced by globalist policies. Also, the speed of adjustment naturally plays a very important role in all this. Economies that can change course relatively quickly may suffer smaller output and job losses than economies in which the deep state, the political corruption, stand in the way of a rapid change. Against this backdrop, it is reasonable to expect that the United States of America will take the lead, and that the already large gap that has opened up between growth and prosperity in the US and Europe, or the euro area, will initially widen even further. Because the EU supporters who are still strongly committed to the globalist agenda will try to defend their power status as long as possible. This will likely include a sharpened restriction of freedom of speech, especially in social media, sticking to climate policy and open border policy, the introduction of central bank digital currency, influencing national elections, etc. At this point, one can think of three basic scenarios. Scenario number 1. America becomes more attractive for investments, getting even more savings from abroad, meaning an increasing flow of capital and talents from, say, Europe to the Western Hemisphere. Europe comes under growing adjustment pressure and must therefore sooner or later follow America's course towards deglobalism. Scenario number 2. The US focuses more strongly on the Western Hemisphere, and Europe, as part of the Eastern Hemisphere, turns towards China's authoritarian, semi-communist approach. The Western world splits apart. A new Iron Curtain falls, so to speak, between America and Europe. And Scenario 3. Washington's departure from globalism proves to be a flash in the pan, at least as a result of the midterm elections on November 3rd, 2026, and it does not succeed in displacing the globalists from their influential, powerful positions, and the West ultimately swings back to an unbridled globalist policy. These three scenarios, certainly more are conceivable, may suffice to illustrate how significant the fork in the road is at which the Western world currently finds itself. The investor will now ask, what does it mean for me and my savings? Here are some basic answers. Answer number 1. As an investor, don't let yourself be distracted, not even by the big picture issues, but rather continue to concentrate on what is really important in investing. That means, for example, even if one assesses the economic future of Europe, the same applies to Japan or America, as comparatively less attractive, that does not necessarily mean avoiding stocks of companies in these regions. Because what matters is to carefully examine whether individual companies are attractive or not, whether their business models have the sought-after characteristics, whether the company's stocks are valued so low that one can buy them, or whether one should better wait for lower prices. Answer number 2. Expect that the depreciation of the purchasing power of fiat currencies will continue, because everywhere in the world people want to continue the fiat money regime. In a deglobalism scenario, however, inflation will probably not be as strong as in a return to globalism scenario. But in both cases, the depreciation of the purchasing power of fiat currencies remains, unfortunately, a constant companion. And answer 3, always be aware that there is a potentially very negative scenario, namely that with the turn away from globalism, the fiat money regime disintegrates, because the production and employment structure that has built up under the fiat money regime literally bursts, and people lose trust in fiat money. In such a case, not only is there a severe loss of purchasing power of fiat money to be expected, the investor must also expect capital and credit default losses. Against this backdrop, from the perspective of Dr. Polleit's Boom and Bust report, a portfolio consisting of A. inflation-resistant corporate stocks and B. a relatively high liquidity position, preferably in gold and silver, remains a sensible strategy. It is a strategy to which the words of Charlie T. Munger fit quite well. He said, quote, "I figure that I want to swim as well as I can against the tides. I'm not trying to predict the tides." Quote ends. So, if you want to know more about how to invest wisely in difficult times, you may want to read Dr. Polleit's Boom and Bust report, written for investors who really want to know, who do not only wish to protect, but also to increase their capital in real terms. All information can be found at boombustreport.com. Thank you very much for your interest and your attention.